We acknowledge the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continuing connection to land, water and sky country. We acknowledge the wine regions and hundreds of different nations around this continent, and the ancient soils on which we stand and grow. From the Wadani salt bush peoples of Margaret River in our west, to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation, and the Southern Island and salt bush peoples of the Nioni peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
We'd like to acknowledge the people of Lutruwita, Tasmania, the original custodians of the land that we live, work and farm on. We pay respects to our elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded.
So hello everyone, and welcome to this exploration of Tasmanian Chardonnay. To begin with, we wanted to set the scene and get you in the mood by transporting you virtually, not just to Australia, but to Tasmania itself. So hold tight for a moment while we just play another very short video featuring the island and some of its winemakers.
Grow grapes here by the edge of the world. They said we were fools, but we knew this land, felt its vibrations. Ancient ranges mount against the roaring 40s, forever shielding. Our friends, they're all kind of family now, pushing the boundaries, passing down our knowledge. Every season, we grow bolder. Every harvest breathes fresh and new. Every taste enticing people to come from near and far. Who knew throwing out the rule book would turn out like this? They called us crazy, but we're growing here, and we're just getting started.
So thank you to you all for tuning in today. I know you're all very busy people. There are lots of virtual tastings happening all the time, but I know that Wine Australia and all the Tasmanian producers featured today really appreciate you giving your time to us and this tasting. In return, I know that we have some beautiful wines for you to taste if you have the tasting pack, and some brilliant winemakers to listen to. So hopefully it will be very much worth your while. Before we get going, there are just a few housekeeping points. So if you look in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you've got the chat function. That's just for sort of saying hello to each other. I haven't got my chat on at the moment, but it's for saying hello to each other and just chit chat, as you might expect. The Q&A section is for questions. So if you'd like to put questions to the winemakers or to Wine Australia, we will try to answer them as we go along. Wine Australia are behind the scenes answering questions. I'll also put any questions that I happen to see to the winemakers. And then if there are any questions left over at the end that haven't been answered, we'll make sure that they do get answered afterwards. I think we've got about 40 people who actually have the wines. Apologies for those of you who haven't, but we will aim to make this as interesting a session as we can, whether you're tasting along or not. But given that not everyone has got the wines, those of you with them, do please feel free to start tasting whenever you like, or I quite often prefer just to leave them till the end, but it's entirely up to you. So you taste them as and when you'd like to. And if you look again in the top right-hand corner, there's a handout section. So you can click there to see the booklet. Not everybody, this is the booklet. I don't think everybody's got a hard copy of that. If you haven't, it's in the handout section. There's also a topographical map, which is in the book, and there's a soils and geology map. So you can find that actually as well, the soils and geology map. If you look at page 8 in your book, there's also there's a QR code in there that you can click on. You see that? And that'll give you the soils and geology map. These are all going to be sent out in a link with the recording of this webinar in an email after the event. So lots of chance to get hold of everything. So why am I here? Well, it's not just because I'm a special expert on Tasmanian wine. I'm not. I'm sure there are many people who are tuning in today who are far more qualified than me when it comes to Tasmanian and more broadly Australian wine. If so, and if you have information as we go along that you think might be interesting, please just share it. Share it through the chat. We'd all love to know extra bits and bobs that we don't already know. But no, the reason I'm here is that I was apparently the last international journalist to visit Tasmania back in December 2018. In fact, by pure coincidence, I flew back from Launceston to Melbourne, Melbourne to Perth, Perth to London, all in one long go. And I landed on this day, the 9th of December, 2018. So exactly 3 years ago. And then the world changed, of course. And within a year, no one was going anywhere. But hopefully, I think it really, well, hopefully won't be too long before Wine Australia and Wine Tasmania is taking some of you to this beautiful, remote and restorative island, because it is just stunning. You hear words like rugged, wild, green, fresh used about Tasmania, and it's full of rivers and valleys, nature in general, wonderful food, lovely people. It's just a very special place. Now, before I introduce our brilliant winemakers to you and we get into discussing the wines, I know the booklet has lots of great information, so you've got access to that, and I'm not going to go over that in detail. But I did just want to pick out a few key facts and also add a couple of thoughts sort of before we begin. So in terms of the bigger picture, I guess what makes Tasmania special, particularly at the moment in the Australian wine landscape, is its relatively cool climate. I remember talking to Andrew Pirrie when I visited, and he's up in the north in Pipers River, his Apogee project. And at the time, he'd just been at a climate change conference where everyone was talking about global warming, and it was being said there that every vineyard would need to go up in altitude by 3 meters a year to compensate for global warming. And what Andrew said, and I quote, was, I won't do it in his fabulous accent, but everyone's going to run out of mountains. So in a world where climate change is threatening so much of the global vineyard, it's easy to see the appeal of a region like Tasmania, which is on the same latitude as New Zealand's South Island. It has a temperate maritime climate, cooled by the breezes from the Southern Ocean to the west, and it has a long growing season. Now, it is wet. It receives 12% of Australia's rain, but Tasmania's vineyards tend to be situated in the eastern third, where it's much drier, thanks to a range of mountains running down the centre that catch the rain and then moderate the rainfall and the temperature in the east. I'm going to leave any more talk of climate to our winemakers who actually live there and know what they're talking about. But as a region, Tasmania is considered a single geographical region. Bit of trivia here, it's the 26th large island in the world. And it's relatively young in terms of its modern wine industry. We're only talking about, well, less than 50 years. And the fact it's considered a single region slightly belies the fact that it's hugely diverse. So as Shirley Davis, CEO of Wine Tasmania, puts it, no two vineyards or vintages are ever the same. So at the moment, there are 7 different unofficial wine growing areas, but I think it's fair to say that producers are still really working out Tasmania's sub-regionality and what each area gives exactly. Tasmania's soils are some of the oldest on the planet and are very varied. We have a wonderful map of the soils and geology of Tasmania that I've talked about. And as I say, you can get it via the QR code in your booklet. And I'd particularly, in fact, I can put it up now for you, just have a very quick look. And let's have just a really quick look at that. It's quite complex and complicated. Will it come up? There we go. So that's what you're going to find if you go in. You need to close in on that to really get anything from it. But I just want to draw your attention to the conclusion section, which essentially sums it up by saying the soils under greatest viticultural development in Tasmania and appearing to offer most potential are the brown and red soils developed from both dolerite and basalt. So there you go. So Chardonnay. We're talking Chardonnay today. We're not talking sparkling wine. We're not talking Pinot Noir, which we tend to think of as Tasmania's calling cards. But we have Chardonnay from right across the wine growing areas of Tasmania. You've got a map. I'll bring up that one just very briefly. You've got a map of where it's a topographical map. There you go. And that gives you, shows you where all the different wineries are that we're talking about today. As I say, that's in your booklet, so you can see that. But we've got Chardonnays from all over Tasmania. We've also got them from a string of consecutive vintages, which is going to be really interesting to look at. And I think the last thing to say before I hand over to our winemakers is that Tasmania is very much about quality over quantity when it comes to wine. These are boutique producers. Just to put that into context, the average price for exported bottled Tasmanian Chardonnay is $19.61 a litre, whereas it's just 4.13 for Australia in general. So there's quite a difference there. Anyway, what I'd like to do now is introduce our 2 winemakers. They are Sam Connew of Stargazer Wine down in the south in the Coal River Valley. I first met Sam on my trip in 2018, and I was completely blown away by her wines. I just remember thinking they all had such incredible purity and energy. They are fabulous wines, as any of you who've tasted them will know. They're all still wines. We also have Oki Myberg, who has been with Joseph Cromie up in the Tamar Valley in the north since 2011. And he's been chief winemaker there since 2020. So he makes both still and sparkling wines. So what I'd love for you to do, Sam and Oki, if you could both briefly introduce yourselves. I know neither of you is Tasmanian, but clearly something drew you there after your travels around the winemaking world. And after that, Sam, I think you're going to give us a general overview of Chardonnay nationally. And Oki, if you could just then set the scene in terms of where Chardonnay fits into the Tasmanian wine picture today.
Thanks so much, Susie. So maybe we should actually put it out there for the audience to figure out where we're both from, respectively, from our accents. I'm sure it won't take too long to put 2 and 2 together. As Susie pointed out, I have my own little label, Stargazer, but some of you may know me from places such as Wurra Vineyards in McLaren Vale, Tower Estate in the Hunter Valley, and then the Australian Wine Research Institute in the Hunter Valley as well. But I've been down in Tasmania now since 2016 permanently, which is obviously far too short a time to call myself Tasmanian. I'm obviously still from away, but enjoying the challenges and the lifestyle of living down here and having my own brand as well. So it's a good part of the world to be in, Susie, as you well know. So yeah.
It is indeed, yeah. And Oki, are you going to give your location away?
Yes, obviously Oki Myberg. I've been in Australia since 2003 now. So I've sort of came to Australia in a sense to come and study more in 2003. basically, and worked my way up in the Australian wine industry. So moved from Sydney. I went to Sydney, studied there, and moved from Sydney then to the Clear Valley. Worked in a winery there for a couple of years, and then during that period, I got an opportunity to move to Tasmania. Never been to Tasmania, didn't know where Tasmania is, what wines they're making, coming from, dry reds, red area, and just fell in love with the place. 2008, I arrived in Tasmania and just absolutely loved it as a winemaker. In that sense, just amazing. The purity of fruit, as we will talk about during this conversation tonight. But yeah, so, and then just immersed myself in the industry, basically. Started doing some wine show judging, done a few now, basically, and just start to learn more and more about, especially sparkling and Chardonnay, especially as two varieties that I really sort of wanted to focus on. But yeah, so I've been in Tassie now for about 13 years. So loving it here, and yeah, don't want to really move anywhere else.
So Sam, do you want to kick us off with some Chardonnay chat?
Yeah, so I think as most people, well, hopefully a lot of people will realise that Australian Chardonnay as a whole is in a pretty awesome place at the moment. And I mean, there's been a lot of work that's gone into changing both the style of Chardonnay and certainly the perception of it from the consumer's point of view. And it's really been a transition over the last 20 years that stylistic change has come about. And I think the joy of it now is not just that Australian Chardonnay full stop is in a good place, but just the depth of regionality that's behind that. And I think Tasmania fits into that seamlessly. So, I mean, we know, obviously, Margaret River, Adelaide Hills, Hunter Valley Chardonnay, Yarra Valley, Mornington Peninsula, Tasmania, I would say. And then you've got, a couple of really strong producers out of Beechworth as well. But to have that depth of regionality behind Australian Chardonnay, I think, is really what's making the varieties sing across the board. And I have, over the last several years, been involved with judging at the James Halliday Chardonnay Challenge, and that's judged on a regional level. So to be able to look at those wines and see the intent behind all of those, and to see how Tasmania stacks up, has been one of the most exciting things, I think, over the last several years. And then obviously myself making Chardonnay down here, just seeing, as Occy was pointing out, the quality of the fruit. And that's really seeing Chardonnay as a table wine really move into a good place.
So Occy, in terms of Tasmania then, do you want to just elaborate a bit more?
Yeah, so in terms of Tasmania, as we know, we sort of really been put on the map in terms of sparkling production, in a sense, and of that sparkling production, the portion is Chardonnay. So we make of the main varieties, 25% of that main varieties is Chardonnay, but only 8% of that 25% is actually still Chardonnay. So we're sort of in a really sort of an awkward position in the moment, because we get such a high demand for sparkling fruit, and obviously in a sort of a really sort of marginal region like Tasmania is, as we will talk about the different areas, weather and climate plays a massive role in terms of ripening the fruit, getting it to the optimal sort of ripeness. So a lot of producers, and you can understand that, and small vineyard owners really sort of favor growing for sparkling rather than for still wines. So there's a real shortage in demand in terms of really high quality still Chardonnay in Tassie. I think we sort of just scratching the surface in terms also of really understanding of where that sort of the really exceptional places is to plant Chardonnay as well. As we will go through the wines tonight as well, clonal selections playing a huge part. When I started in Tasmania, pretty much the clone that most people use in Tassie was the I10V1 clone. And now you're starting to see a lot of different clones coming in. You get your Mendoza clones coming in. your 95s and 96 Bernard clones. So now we're starting to see really in terms of, Tasmanian Chardonnay, quite a variety of styles and interesting wines as well. And yeah, I think there's a bit more interest and focus on Chardonnay, especially still Chardonnay coming especially in the Tasmanian market, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I definitely found when I tasted these wines, one of the big things about them, beside their quality, was the range of styles. So I think should we move on to our first wine, and we can start talking through the different areas, what each area gives. So the first wine number 1, is Devil's Corner. It's from 2021, so a very young wine, and I think fair to say probably the most fruit forward. Not as complex as some of the other ones, not oaky in the way that some of the others are. But I think Sam, you're going to talk about this one, aren't you?
Yeah, so 21, obviously this is the newest one in the bracket. So 75% of the fruit is from the east coast of the island, and 25% from the Tamar Valley, which is where we are right now, so just north of Launceston. As you pointed out, Susie, it's probably, in terms of complexity, it's not really meant to be a terribly complex wine. Tom Wallace, who's the winemaker, said it's meant to be an early drinking, approachable style. So they actually ferment this in tank, but initially it's fermented in tank and then transferred to older oak later on. But to try and build some complexity through it, they have a higher level of solids in the juice, and then it's wild fermented as well. So they're trying to build some complexity into what's an early drinking style. And I think that achieves it pretty well. But it's got some, some really nice kind of lemonade fruit coming through on the nose, and just that crisp, bright acidity, which is really the hallmark, I guess, of the Tas. If you're going to kind of put a link between these various styles, and I agree there's a lot of stylistic difference, and we can talk about why that is. But the common thread through Tasmanian Chardonnay is always acid. So,
and is there something that the East Coast, you would say, gives as opposed to the other areas?
Well, the East Coast is generally a couple of degrees warmer than Hobart down south, so it's probably the warmer areas, one of the warmer sub-regions in Tasmania. And certainly from the perception of a winemaker across both Pinot and Chardonnay, you tend to see fuller, richer styles with both of those table wines. So, we think about them as being mouth-filling and opulent, generous wines, with maybe a little bit more mouthfeel rather than acid line and length, which is how you would describe some of the other regions.
Okay, and this, just to add this, this, as we say, is probably one of the less complex wines. It is one of the least expensive as well. So this is £23. So none of them are cheap Chardonnays. We've said, they're very much boutique production. And I love the freshness of this and the fruity, lovely pear fruit. It almost had a little bit of a sort of a New World Chablis feel to it for me, and I enjoyed that. Please, everybody, if you've got things to say about the wines, pop them up on the chat, or do feel free to ask questions as we go along. But yeah, just a nice one to kick us off. It's quite aperitif style, isn't it? That particular wine. So we're going to move on from the least expensive to the most expensive, Tall Puddle Chardonnay 2020. So we're moving from the East Coast, moving south to the rather unusually cool and dry Coal River. So it's quite an unusual combination. So Sam, I think you're going to talk about this, aren't you, as well? Tell us about Tall Puddle and this particular wine.
So Tall Puddle is owned by the Shaw and Smith Winery, located in the Adelaide Hills in South Australia. So this was an established vineyard that they purchased in 2012. It was planted originally in 1988. It's all Chardonnay and all Pinot. They've done a lot of work since they purchased the property in terms of both grafting and replanting to newer clones. So some of the Bernard clones that Occy was talking about. This is the first time that I've seen the 2020, and it's a stunning wine. This recently, I think, got 3 or 4 trophies at the Royal Melbourne Wine Awards, or Melbourne Royal Wine Awards. As you know, Australians are obsessed with wine shows, so trophy gold is all good for us. I think it was best individual wine best individual vineyard wine, best Chardonnay, best Tasmanian wine, something like that.
And that was this vintage, was it?
Yeah, this vintage, this very wine. So so it's great to be able to have a look at this.
Yeah.
They have really been refining this style over the last few years. They picked reasonably early, I think, but you can see that that's got some really beautiful lees work. I think it's all wild fermented. It certainly smells like it. We were just talking before, generally they put their wines through Mailer. We can't find any reference to what percent or whether it is through malolactic. So we can talk about that. It's got some beautiful reduction on the nose, but I think the palate is really what's so striking about it. It's just that nervy acidity, and it's really what the Coal River Valley is all about. So my vineyard's just 10k up the road from Tolpuddle, so I know this part of the world reasonably well, and it's a beautiful vineyard and obviously producing some cracking wine.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember, I for me, this is like sort of, Tasmania's answer to a great white Burgundy. It is just a stunning wine, in every way. It's so harmonious. I remember though when I was arrived in Tasmania, the first morning after breakfast, having a tasting of Pinots that were, I think, half a dozen Pinots that Cheryl gave me, and there was the Tolpuddle Pinot Noir 2017, and I was just blown away. It was such a refined and fine, elegant wine that had everything in that you want from a great Pinot. And so they are doing some brilliant stuff. I mean, you pay for it, but then it is incredibly good, so that's absolutely fair enough. We've got a question come in that I would like to ask, from Gabriel Stone, who couldn't attend live, but who said it would be interesting to hear how much Tasmanian fruit is being blended into bigger brands from the mainland, and whether there's any shifting trend on that front. I suppose either way, really.
Look, I think that's an interesting question. I think from, I don't know if we've got some stats behind it, but I would suspect that not much, because why would you use the Tasmanian brand, which is has got such incredible cachet on the national market domestically in terms of the consumers, and then sort of dilute that with, but mind you, that might be me with my Tasmanian hat on, waving my Tassie flag. So, I mean, one of the great examples, obviously, is in terms of using Tasmanian fruit in a mainland brand is Penfolds Utana, but that's kind of, I wouldn't say that was a typical scenario.
Yeah, I totally agree with Sam. I think, at the moment, you also look at, the price of fruit we're paying for in Tasmania, like if you're talking about, high quality Chardonnay, you will pay starting at about $3,500 a tonne. So, it just doesn't make economic sense then to go and blend it away with something from the mainland. I think, we're trying to grow exceptional fruit here, and you've got the brand Tasmania now behind it. It just makes much more sense to have it as a Tasmanian brand wine at the moment. And I think, we're not a huge amount that's going off the island to be blended at the moment. No.
I mean, actually, interesting enough, the Tolpuddle wine, it was Glen Eyre, wasn't it? And they sold a lot of fruit, so they were somebody who was selling fruit, and obviously that trend with Martin Shaw and Michael Hill-Smith has now been to not sell it, and to actually make wine and invest and take it up a notch. So hopefully, maybe that's sort of a sign of what is happening. It's going that way rather than the other way.
I think, Susie, also just to say something quickly, is when I started in 2008 in Tasmania, we there was a period where we had actually quite a lot of surplus wine sitting around, but in the last sort of 5 to 6 years, that's basically dried up. So there's really not much around. There's a few plantings happening now, big plantings coming into Tasmania, but as I said, like in terms of finding top quality Chardonnay, it is really hard to find it. So yeah, I think every morsel that's around will be used in Tasmania for Tasmanian brands at the moment. Yeah. So.
Good. Well, I hope everybody's enjoying that. Anybody who's got that wine, it's a bit of a stunner. Shall we move on to the home oak? So home oak is 2019, so we're going back yet another year, and we've gone from the south and we're going right up to the north to the Tamar Valley, and this wine is made by Rebecca Duffy at Home Oak. It's a smaller vineyard, 15 hectares. It's a warm site. Rebecca's husband Tim is the grape grower, and I believe they've been there 14 years. So do you want to tell us a bit more about the estate and the wine? You're the man for this.
Yeah, no, listen, the Home Oak wines, especially this Chardonnay and vineyard, is sort of gone from leaps and bounds. I think they've put a lot of work into this vineyard, especially Tim is an exceptionally hard worker. He spends a lot of time in the vineyard. And as we all know, great wines get made in the vineyard. So they're actually a really good little team, Tim and Beck. Beck's the winemaker, as you said, and they're based in an area in the Tamar River. They are a warmer side of Tamar. The Tamar River is generally a little bit warmer. They tend to have a fruit spectrum that's a little bit more forward. So, you look at the Tolpa, much more lime acid drive. The Tamar River tends to have a bit more of a sort of a richness around it. So they tend to be a bit more fruit forward and rounder in their profile. We tend to get a little bit, we get about sort of between 600 and 100 mils of rain in the Tamar.
Okay, just to let you know,
which is sort of average for the east side. But what we, sorry.
You're just cutting out a little bit. I think there's a bit of a delay and you're cutting out a little bit. I don't know if that's happening for everybody, but you could just maybe repeat what you said in the last minute or so.
Yeah. I think you're cutting out a little bit as well.
Okay. Maybe it's me.
Hear us okay now, Susie?
That's better. Yeah.
Can you hear us now, Susie?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure
what
else is hearing.
But so just to recap, the Tamar Valley is the highest, it's got the highest vineyards or the highest bearing vineyards in Tasmania. So we've got about 28% of the fruit bearing vineyards of Tasmania. So it is quite a unique little area. It's quite a consistent and grape growing region. We sort of tend to grow on this sort of really black crackling clays, which tend to hold water and hold heat, which makes the vines, love that sort of soils. They grow really, really, really well on it. So I think that Chardonnay, as you said, you're looking at that Chardonnay, Beck, you tend to have, playing around with a little bit of sort of 20% of neo oak in that wine. It's all wild fermented as well. It's about 20% malolactic in there as well. So you tend to get a little bit more layers in that wine. There's that sort of real sort of lemon kernels in it, a bit more richness, toasty nuttiness in that wine. But it's a typical Tamar Valley sort of Chardonnay. As I said, it's quite rich and round, and it's got quite a sort of a nice sort of full texture as well. So I think 2019 was quite a warm year, so that also pushes the fruit a little bit more forward from the 2019 vintage. But overall, quite a nice little stunning little wine.
Yeah, I have to say, when I first opened my little bottle this morning, I felt like it needed a bit of opening up. So I don't know if everybody feels that. It's it just seemed a little bit strange to begin with, and the more air it's got, it's gone back to what I would have expected it to be. Oki, given we've tasted 3 different vintages so far, could I ask you to sum up the 5 vintages that we're tasting today, if possible, and just talk about vintage variation in general in Tasmania, because I don't think it's quite so pronounced, is it, as it is in other parts of Australia? Is that right?
Yes, definitely. There's one thing in Tasmania. If you make wine in Tasmania, you have to learn very quickly that one year is not the same as the next year. So I sort of found it for me, it took me about, sort of a good session of about 3 to 4 years to sort of really get a good handle of the vintage variation. When I started here, we had these sort of vintages of 3, like they used to come in sort of sections of 3. You used to get quite a warmer vintage with higher crops. The next year was a little bit sort of lesser, cooler climate. The crops was a little bit lower, and then the third year was quite a low, cool, quite a wet year. But you sort of cycle through those seasons basically. But in terms of the wines we've looked at now, the 2018 vintage, 2020 wines from the Devil's Corner. 2020 was quite, sorry?
21.
21. The 2021 Devil's Corner Chardonnay, that vintage tend to be, for us this year, was quite a cool year. It sort of tend to really pronounce and sort of give you that really lifted aromatics in the wine. So we had quite a cool year. Not as much rain as 2020. 2020 we had a huge amount of rain. It's probably the most rain we've had in about 20 years in a short space of time, right in vintage. So it was quite nerve-wracking in 2020, and it was quite cold. So we really struggled to push to get through and get the wines to optimal temperature quality. But the wines that was made from those years was exceptional because we had to really pick just the best fruit off and make exceptional wines from that. The 2019 vintage, once again, was quite, for me, that was the year where everything just went 100% right from start to finish. We had this beautiful, we had a nice wet sort of winter the year before. And then from December on into the following year in January, February, we just had this beautiful warm climate. We had amazing fruit set. So we had just a perfect vintage. It just went, once we started, we didn't stop. There was no interruptions with rain or anything like that. It was just beautifully formed bunches. We had low disease pressure, which that made it so much easier for us in the winery, basically. So that was really, really good. Then the 2017 vintage, which, sorry, I'm sort of doing it a bit out of order, but the 2017 vintage was one where we had quite a wet, cold sort of winter and spring. We had a really disruptive flowering season as well. So we got a lot of hen and chicken that year, which led into still sort of below average temperatures into the beginning of vintage the following year, which brought smaller crops but quite intense wines. So the wines, once again, was made out of that year it's really exceptional, quite concentrated. They had smaller berries, as I said, because of the hen and chicken, and tend to, with Chardonnay, actually work really well because you get much more concentration out of them. So yeah, so 2017 was a bit of a trick. We harvested a little bit later, but we got it all off, and it was quite a good year. And then the 2020 vintage, as I sort of just alluded to it, was quite a wet year, wet and cold year. So that year was a real struggle to get the vines, the fruit to stay intact on the vines and get them ripe. But I think we're going to look back at 2020. We tasted a couple of 2020 wines today and sort of over the week. And at the time, we were quite sort of nervous at how these wines are going to turn out. But I think they're looking actually quite exceptional. They're actually coming into their own. And the more we taste them, we just tend to go, this is actually going to turn out to be quite exceptional year for all the struggles and all the sort of nervous periods where we had to wait to make sure that these fruit just stay intact and not, because in Tasmania, we can lose a whole crop overnight because of botrytis or something happening. So it's just quite a nerve-wracking period. But I think the wines that coming out of the 2020 vintage is looking really, really good at the moment. So, but yeah, once again, quite a diverse. You can see there's wet years, there's cold years, then you get this warm year that just push everything forward. But what stays true to Tasmania is our cool night, which then retains our natural acidity. We can't be Tasmania if we don't keep that natural acidity. That natural acidity holds everything together for us. And you'll see through these wines, they just have this beautiful focus and backbone, which just stays with them. Even, some of these wines are 100% malolactic, but you wouldn't even say that because it just got that beautiful natural acidity that just holds that wines together. So yeah, that's
lovely.
It is quite diverse. Yeah.
Thank you, Oki. Thanks. We're going to move on to Stargazer next. We're heading back down to the south to the Coal River Valley, and it's your wine, Sam, isn't it? So really over to you, because we want to hear what you did to create this wonderful wine.
Thanks so much, Susie. I should point out that whilst it says in the tasting book that it's from the Coal River Valley, which is where my vineyard is, the fruit for this is actually sourced from the Upper Derwent. So I planted Chardonnay at my place in 2017. So until those vines get to full production, I'm still sourcing fruit from growers outside of, mainly in the Coal River Valley, but in this instance, it comes from the Upper Derwent. So if you have a look on the map that you've got, it's actually from the evocatively named, the vineyard's just outside of the evocatively named village of Ouse, which is right in the heart of Tasmania, just south of the Great Lakes. Probably the most inland vineyard, I would say, in Tasmania. So as Oki was pointing out before in terms of the importance of cool nighttime temperatures, the experience with the growing season at Ouse is that it's probably warmer during the day but colder at night. So that classic continental growing season pattern. The grower there, Bernard Brain, is a bit of a character. He grows he's a farmer and he happens to grow grapes, and sells quite a large proportion to other well-known companies like Accolade and Penfolds. And he regularly gets his Chardonnay into Penfolds and to Yatana. But this clone, Bernard 7S6, for some reason Penfolds don't like it. They think it's too aromatic, but I love the aromatics on this particular clone. It's got that real grapefruit juice, ruby grapefruit juice character coming through. 18 was a relatively warm year for Bernard up through there. So for that reason, it's only gone through partial malolactic fermentation, and I change that around each year depending upon the season and how warm it is. So just to give you an idea, I guess, even in that warmer year, this was still picked at the beginning of April. So in terms of what Oki was talking about before with the growing seasons, when you bear in mind that we start bud burst in September, which is not that dissimilar to other Chardonnay grape growing areas in Australia, like the Hunter would start in late August, early September as well. But our growing season goes through September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April. So, now that I've got my grape grower hat on, that's an incredibly long growing season. And that's, 6 or 7 months of sitting on the edge of your seat worrying about the weather half the time. But a pretty perfect growing season through 2018. This was handpicked, obviously, as a lot of premium Chardonnay is in Tasmania, a whole bunch pressed. Generally, it would get no enzyme, obviously. It gets settled for about 8 hours just to kind of get the chunky bits out. And then straight to 500 litre puncheons. I think about 25% new. 40% new. According to my notes. And then indigenous yeasts start the ferment off. So and the lees, the chunky lees from the tank I chuck into another vessel for ferment, and then depending upon how feral they are post ferment, I'll blend them back or use them as topping wine, and that works out pretty well. So it spends about 10 months in oak, no lees stirring. with the larger surface area of the puncheons, I think that it doesn't need any extra lees work on top of that. And then spends a couple of months in tank prior to bottling. So it's pretty straightforward winemaking from that perspective.
Straightforward winemaking, Sam. It's not a straightforward wine though. It's absolutely gorgeous. And again, it has for me that energy that your wines have. And it's got I got a lovely kind of roasted lime citric core to this, that was rich but refreshing and just so mouthfilling, just beautiful. And we are getting some questions that I keep seeing them and wanting to ask them, and then I think they get answered. But Stephen Barrett wanted to know, going back to this quality grapes being hand harvested, he said, how much, what proportion would you say is machine harvested of Tasmania's quality grapes?
I don't know. It's certainly, I'm not sure if we've got any numbers on that. It's certainly changing a lot with the newer vineyards coming on board, and we've got a couple of contractors now down here who are using the Pelonc selective harvesting machines, which do an amazing job. I would say that the vast majority of machine harvested fruit gets used in sparkling wine. Oki, you probably know more about that than me. But certainly I think that technology there's two factors there. The technology is obviously getting better and better in terms of machine harvesting, and certainly with vintages where there's any pressure to get the fruit off, being able to access those harvesters to get the fruit off as and when you need it. And then secondly, what we're seeing, and this will happen more and more as the industry expands, is just having those contractors around who can actually, that's their job, to do those specialized tasks like machine harvesting, running pruning teams, all that kind of thing, which makes it a lot easier for vineyard owners like me to get in. And that, because the industry base has been so small up until now, we just haven't had the base to really support that. So that's a very welcome change for us now. So yeah.
I've got a little thing here from Jamie Good. Hi, Jamie. And he said, is there a bit of reduction here? Not really the matchstick style, more of a vinyl direction, but is there some reduction in this, Sam?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's very much something that a lot of Chardonnay producers in Australia are not searching for, but I think we've got to, and it's not, Chardonnay has probably led the charge, but I think we're playing around with that a lot more, even with Pinot now as well, as really searching for those levels of complexity, whether it's, and I always talk about good sulfide versus bad sulfide, and the difference between those two elements. I guess with my winemaking in particular, well, and I can only speak in terms of my experience, but the two factors there are the wild ferment and greater solids and the juice, because the juice isn't 100% clarified, and then highly protective winemaking in terms of cold storage conditions over winter. I have a pretty fastidious approach to making sure that everything's topped regularly, and just really gentle handling. So you do get a little bit of that reduction coming through as well, but I have absolutely no problems with that.
I don't think we do. Sam, just briefly before we move on to the next wine, you use, as you said, the Bernard 76 clone, I think, in this. You just use one clone. If we look through the booklet, there is a whole range of clones being used. Some people use one, some people use a whole load. What is the thinking at the moment in terms of a clonal approach? I know Oki sort of touched on it earlier on, but in terms of Tasmanian Chardonnay and clones, is there one, or are there a range that are being proven to be particularly effective, particularly good?
Well, I guess, when you look back at the history of Tasmanian Chardonnay, the workhorse has, and not just Tasmanian Chardonnay, but across Australia, the workhorse has always been I10V1. On the mainland, there's more of the Penfolds clone as well, P58. But more and more now we're seeing these newer clones come through. I think, and there's two aspects there. Obviously, more of us are playing around with single vineyard wines, so having that clonal diversity means that you can search for complexity across your wines within the single vineyard, because those clonal differences mean that you can pick at different times, and they've obviously got different flavour profiles. What I'm seeing at my vineyard, and I've got four clones planted, so 76, 95, 96 and 548, is simply the difference in the growing season and the key growing season times. So that gives us some insurance in those longer growing seasons, knowing that you can maybe get something off a little bit earlier. You know, one's going to be a little bit earlier, one will be a bit later. So it's, you know, flowering could be, like we're just starting to go through flowering in the Coal River Valley now. So flowering is happening at different times as well. So you're just kind of assured that you're always going to have one clone that can kind of get across the line. And that can be, and that applies not just to Chardonnay, but to Pinot as well, obviously. So it's a little bit of making sure that you've got a horse in the race that can get through to the finish line. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, let's move on. So Joseph Cromie Chardonnay. So we're back up in the north of the island for our final two wines. The first is the Joseph Cromie 2018 Occhi. Perhaps you can tell us about this wine. Did you make this Occhi, or was it still Jeremy Deneen? Who was
still there? Yeah, Jeremy was still there. Yes. Yeah. But yeah, listen, the 2018 Joseph Cromie Chardonnay and our vineyard is sort of located in the most southern part of the Tamar Valley. So we're right on the edge of the Tamar Valley, which we're in this sort of unique sort of microclimate that's sort of sheltered to the west from the weather and then to the east. So we tend to, when the weather comes in from the north, they tend to push sort of to the east past us and sort of to the west past us. So we tend to get not too much rain around our region. We sit around about 600 mils a year. We've got a vineyard that is, you know, we've got vines on the flats that's about 80 meters above sea level that, and also the highest point on our vineyard is about 180 meters above sea level. And that's where this Chardonnay is sitting. The Chardonnay is sitting at the top of the vineyard, facing sort of northeast. It is a I10V1 clone, as I said before. It's a single vineyard wine. So Joseph Cromie's Chardonnays, majority of them is single vineyard wines. We just don't have any other sort of real Chardonnays sourced from across the state. So we make our wines from this one particular block of the vineyard. It is basically our winemaking over the years since I've been there. I've been there now 11 years. From when I started to where we are now, is really sort of pushed into almost this spectrum of trying to layer our Chardonnays. So what I mean by that is from the picking, we're all picking by hand, as you guys discussed earlier. So all our fruit is picked by hand. It's a whole bunch press. We pick it in the morning quite early, so it's quite cold. Then we whole bunch press it. The juice we will split into basically two. So a portion of it will go straight into barrels, all French barriques, which is about 30% new oak. And then the other portion will go into stainless steel tank, which will spend 24 hours in that tank and will settle out just the heavy solids out of it. And then the next morning, it will then get racked into French barriques, basically. And then we will also treat those two different parcels very different as well. The full solid parcel will be all wild fermentation, and then the clarified, semi-clarified portion we will then inoculate with the commercial yeast. So the reason why we do that is basically, as I said earlier, just to layer our wines. It's definitely just to try and get different characters and different textures and flavor profiles of our wines. We tend to see that this clone, the I10V1, tend to, if you don't get the picking right, or if you pick it too late, it get quite blousy and it can just get a little bit broad. So we just want to make sure that we sort of get a bit of complexity into the wine and sort of pushing a little bit more of that savory spectrum into the wine. The wines will then spend, we don't do any malolactic fermentation, or the 18 had no malolactic fermentation. And I think when you taste the wine, you can probably see that sort of really sort of like crunchy green apple acid that flows through that wine. but it will spend about sort of 12 months in oak to mature. As Sam sort of mentioned with her wines, we do pretty much the same. We don't do a lot of barrel stirring. We just tend to sort of really get the wines topped and hold them over that sort of summer period, which is that whole December, January period where it gets quite warm in Tasmania. So we just want to protect the wines. But yeah, as I said, a single vineyard wine, that rich toasty oak notes coming out in the wine. But yeah, you can see that from Tamar Valley, quite a rich sort of pushing that fruit quite forward in our wines compared to, say, Sam's wine, which is much more elegant and sort of focused, basically. But yeah, that's in a nutshell, Joseph Cremy Chardonnay.
Brilliant. I think we'll move on to the final one. We've got 5 minutes left. So it's the Dalrymple Cave Block Chardonnay from 2017. So this is from the Pipers River. It's the oldest wine in the lineup, as you can see. Dalrymple was established back in 1987. It's now part of the Hillsmith Family Vineyards Group. The wine's made by Peter Caldwell. Oki, do you want to talk us through it?
Yeah, so just quickly, just a quick snapshot of the region. So Pipers River, it's the sort of really northern part, quite a cold and wet region. So they tend to be much later in ripening than, say, for instance, just maybe 10, 20 kilometers south of their vineyard. The soils up there is quite red fertile soils, so they tend to have quite a high capacity to retain water as well. So they're quite free draining. All there, it's quite important in the Pipers River region that your aspect is right. So you want to get that sort of northern facing slopes for your especially for your still grapes, for your Chardonnay, because they ripen later, so you really start going into that marginal April period where it gets quite cold and wet. So yeah, Pete has selected, I think the cave block comes of 2 little parcels of the Dalrymple vineyard consistently from year to year. He tends to do gets hand-picked, whole bunch pressed, and then it goes into pungence, which it will spend about 10 months in there. I think it's about 30% new oak, and then partially malo, so 20% malolactic fermentation on that wine. But yeah, a beautiful, typical character of the cave block in that Pipers River region is you tend to see quite a saline, sort of briny component. I don't know, Susie, if you tasted Andrew Petty's wines, which is just around the corner from there, they tend to really have quite a briny, salty character into them. And I think you see it in this Chardonnay. It's got a real savory, salty, briny character. And I think it's, a lot of people say Pete says it's because they're quite close to the ocean. You get that sort of ocean winds coming over the vineyard, and he tends to get that really, that beautiful briny character in his wines. But 17, it's a stunning wine. It's holding up really, really well, and I think it's looking beautifully well balanced, and it's just got a purity about it.
I was quite interested with the 2017 because I know when I was in Australia that the 2017 Chardonnays were just showing so well. It was such a lovely vintage, wasn't it? I remember Jeremy Deneen saying that it was a great vintage for winemakers and a terrible vintage for accountants. Yeah. But it was the wines were lovely, and I thought, gosh, it'd be interesting to see how a wine from that vintage has aged, over the last 4 years. And it's definitely of the lineup, the one that has the more sort of savoury, tertiary, slightly truffly, mushroomy character to it. But still that lovely kind of core. It is slightly, the acidity is a bit lower, but it still feels fresh and so interesting, so lovely to taste. Brilliant. Okay, well, I think we're just about out of time. So I'd love to know if anyone has a particular favourite wine. So if you do, don't be shy, pop it on the chat. It would be really interesting to know. I think there's some amazing wines there, and I'm sure everybody has, given the difference in style. In fact, I'm going to look at chat and see if anybody's putting anything there. But I think given the difference in style, there's a potential for people to like various different ones. So thank you, Sam and Oki. You can go off now and have a well-earned glass of Chardonnay or an espresso martini. Sam, wasn't that your tipple of choice?
No, I think time for that is gone. It's going to be a cup of cocoa for now.
You're in bed. Thank you very much to Cheryl Lee Davis, who is CEO of Wine Tasmania, and to the Tasmanian government. They supported this event. I'd like to say thank you also to everyone at Wine Australia for putting on these Connect webinars and tastings. I've joined in on quite a few of them, and they're so well organised, and they're really useful and just brilliant to be part of. And then just as we end things off and sign off, I would like to say a final thank you to all of you for tuning in, and cheers with whichever wine you prefer.
Thanks, Susie.